Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fernandez Ranch. My name is Dean Kelch. I'm a local botanist. Today I'm going to be leading this virtual hike of the Fernandez Ranch. This property has been preserved by the Muir Land Trust, a local land trust that has really managed to acquire a lot of beautiful properties in this particular area of the southern part of the Carquinez Strait. It's also co-sponsored by the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District, which is an organization that does a lot of good work, particularly when it comes to water quality and restoring riparian areas. So today is a beautiful spring day, gorgeous. Yesterday we had quite a bit of rain, but today it's actually sunny with nice puffy clouds. And we're going to see a lot of the spring wildflowers that are common around in this area, as well as many of the woody plants, the trees and shrubs that kind of form the main plant communities in this particular site. So without hesitation, let's go, let's start, and we'll start our hike. This is the main meadow of the Fernandez Ranch. Remember, the name of this site is the ranch, and it used to be a ranch property. Just like almost all the areas of grassland around the whole Bay Area, even a lot of areas of woodland, this area was heavily grazed for well over 100 years. And there's still cattle. They're run out in this site, and one of the big reasons to run the cattle is so that they help control some of the non-native weeds and things that are growing that dominate particularly these low areas with nice, thick, rich soil. And if we look through this area right now where we're starting out, we don't see a lot of native plants. We see a lot of non-native species, particularly these annual grasses that mostly came from the Mediterranean area very early on in European colonization of California area. And also some of the forbs or the non-grassy weeds too that come from that particular area. And if we walk around a little bit and poke around, we might see a few of the natives, but not too many. Not too many in these areas. Here we have lots of mustards. You can see all the grasses around us. And aha, over here, I almost walked by it. Here's one of our nice native wildflowers. This particular wildflower is the yellow owl's clover. You can see it right here growing surrounded by all these non-native grasses and other weeds, including mayweed right here next to it. And this is a little plant that belongs to this group that has many different species that live in the grasslands of California. But just like almost all these little annuals, these little native wildflowers, they're not doing quite as well as they used to. When we walk up the hill, we're likely to see more of these, because when you get up the hill, we get to areas that perhaps they were grazed, certainly, but not as heavily grazed for so long as these areas down here. And also the soil's a little bit thinner, so that the native species seem to have more of a competitive edge in these areas that have thinner or less fertile soil than they do down here in these very rich, deeper soil, where these weeds, grasses, and other weeds from the Mediterranean region that have been co-evolving with human disturbance for thousands of years seem to really are favored down in these areas. So, but let's move on. So let's start moving on until we get to the some of the little more native areas of the site. Where we're standing right here, I'd like to, is a good place as any for us to talk about some of the major plant communities we're going to see here today, or we are seeing here as we're here today on our virtual tour. As we just went over, we walked through the meadow with a lot of grasses and a lot of little herbaceous plants, most of which are not native. But as we get over here, a little bit more to the east, we can see we're starting to get shrubs and then past the shrub zone, we have a bunch of trees. Now what we're looking at here is a transition between 3 different of the most common habitats in the San Francisco Bay Area. One is grassland of various kinds. Second of all is what would be called northern coastal scrub, and that's dominated by what is the most common shrub in California. Is probably this one right here. This is coyote brush, Baccharis pilularis, and you'll see this everywhere. It's a rather nondescript thing, but you can recognize it once you get to know it pretty well. It doesn't flower really, oddly enough, until summer. So most of the time of the year when you see it, it'll be like this, just green. And then behind there, you'll see a bunch of trees. In this particular area, this is along the creek, so we could call this a riparian forest, if you will, but it really is a phase of what we might call in general the mixed evergreen forest, which is a dominant forest type where you find forest in this whole part of Northern California. And this particular phase of the forest would be dominated by 2 species. One is an oak, Quercus agrifolia, the coast live oak, and the other one being the California bay, the Umbellularia californica. Now, this interesting mixture of oaks and members of the laurel family happens here and there across the world in these subtropical to warm temperate areas that have usually periods of at least slight drought. Not always as much drought as we have here in California, but you do find these mixtures. Here we're finding a very not very speciose part of it, where mostly it's just 2 species growing together along the higher reaches of the creek. Of course, if we went down further into the creek, we'd start finding the real riparian or riverine species like willows and things like that, and we'll see some of those as we go along later. This is a coast live oak, Quercus agrifolia. So if any of you live anywhere in North America, or really almost anywhere in the northern hemisphere where there's woody vegetation, you probably have oaks. Sometimes they're evergreen, sometimes they're deciduous. In California and here in Fernandez Ranch, we have both kinds in California. And so we'll see both these evergreen oaks that are just starting to put out their new leaves, but still have the leaves from last year, even while they're flowering. Now, maybe some of you didn't really think about oaks flowering, but of course they do. You can see these little tassels hanging down. These are the catkins that are the male flowers that have the pollen, and then the female flowers would be nestled in the ends of the new growth, because of course they eventually mature into what? Into acorns. And I actually picked this little branchlet of one from last year that still has some of the acorns on it that never matured really. They just aborted. So this particular one shows this is really an oak. So no matter what the leaves look like, if it's deciduous or evergreen or whatever, you can tell it's an oak if it has acorns. That's how you can tell it's oak. Of course, it only usually has acorns in the fall, so it's always nice to learn some other ways to do it. It also produces it's a major food source for almost every kind of animal you can imagine around here. And back before Europeans came here, the acorn crop was the major food crop of the Native Americans who lived in this area. Of course, they are full of tannins. They're very bitter tasting if you just eat them. So they had very often very long, laborious ways to remove these bitter elements to make it edible, to make the starch edible. But obviously these acorns can some years produce a very, very good food source. The problem with acorns as a food source is not just the bitterness, but also the fact that they're extremely unreliable. Some years there's almost none. Some years there's a whole lot. And this is in response usually to environmental or climatic or just weather type situation. However, it's not an accident because so many things, insects, rodents, birds, and humans, of course, love to eat acorns. Acorns tend to they have these some years they produce so many acorns that not they can't all be eaten. Some of them survive to grow into new trees. Other years they have such low amounts that the things that rely on those acorns to live die off and have very low population levels. And that's how you get these nice, then big mast years, as they call them, when they produce lots of acorns. And at that point in time, like I said, they're low populations of the things that feed on them, and it takes them a while to build up their population. And during that one season, then they can replenish their numbers by having a lot of small seedlings. And you'll still see this in some years where we have a good mast year of acorns, where then the next spring and the year after that and year after that, you'll see a lot of these young little coast live oaks coming up around. Some of the other oak species we have here don't seem to reproduce as well. Most like the blue oak, which we'll see later, mostly will only reproduce very rarely, and most of the plants you see, even though they're not as big as this, are very, very old indeed. Now right here we can see a deciduous tree that's just starting to put out some of its leaves. This is the valley oak. This is the largest oak in California. Quercus lobata is its name, and it's very common up and down the Central Valley and in the central and southern coast range of California. And when you go further north, it tends to drop out and is replaced by Oregon oak. But here it is many different habitats. It can be, particularly in the Central Valley, it was the dominant tree of the giant riparian gallery forests that were here when Europeans first came here along the rivers of the Central Valley. But even out here, it can grow as here along a creekside, if it can find another place and not be outcompeted by coast live oak. But also you find it up in these north-facing slopes and these sloping areas where it forms sort of an open woodland or even a savanna sometimes, where it gets a fair amount of water, not as dry as, say, the blue oak, but still very common. And but it's down here in these valleys where you really get some size on these things. You really see them getting huge and deserving the reputation as the largest oak in North America. Now the leaves of this oak are very much like the white oak. They're a white oak group, which tend to have these deciduous lobed leaves. This is very much like the white oak of eastern North America in many ways. These are just starting to emerge, but soon they'll be much larger than the leaves of the evergreen oaks that we have here. This is nice. We're walking along a side channel of the main creek here, and we can see many of these natural species that occur in this riparian zone. Down in the channel itself, we have in the foreground we have California Bay. Behind it, we have California buckeye, a deciduous species. Back there, the large tree would be coast live oak. And here in the foreground, where we have a little more sun, where the trees haven't taken over yet, we have coyote brush with a bunch of poison oak growing up through it, a very common species around here, a little bit of snowberry, as well as, if we look further down in the channel, some nice willow trees that are growing there where they have their roots in water all year long. And this is the kind of vegetation you find along all the creeks in this part of California. And it's sort of this mixture of what we would see as a regular creekside vegetation and what we also describe as sort of a general evergreen woodland type vegetation you also find in north-facing slopes. The things I always look for as spring begins is the very first California buttercups to raise their heads and to open up their little flowers. As you can see, this is a beautiful spring wildflower. It has these nice multi-petaled flowers that are not only bright yellow, but if you look at them in this bright sun, you can see how shiny they are. It's if they've been lacquered. And so even though they're not very big flowers, when they have displays like this of thousands and thousands of plants, it makes a beautiful display that is really is the most cheerful things about spring in this particular area. This is a Woodland Star here, a little member of the saxifrage family. It's a Lithophragma heterophylla. And this is a plant, little white-flowered plant that has these nicely little cut petal. Each petal is cut into 3 or more pieces. And there are 2 species that are very common around here. One is this one that grows in the shaded edge of woodland areas, and another area, one that grows out in a little more, also on steep banks, but a little more sunlight. We've got manroot too, or wild cucumber, but I'd like to see it in flower. Ooh, here's a nice plant, but not flowering here. This little vine here that I'm showing you is an odd little vine. It's here and there. It's not particularly rare, but it very rarely flowers, and so it makes you wonder almost how it forms seed and spreads around. Of course, once it does form a nice population, it can send up these little roots underground, these little stems grow underground and come up and form almost an ineradicable patch. And these patches can be pretty good size, which is a good thing for at least one butterfly. And this is the California pipevine that we're looking at, Aristolochia californica. And this is the only local food plant of the pipevine swallowtail butterfly. And whenever you are out walking this time of year or a little bit later in spring, you'll see these very large black butterflies with these iridescent blue hind wings. This is the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, and it's usually, if you look at it and follow it long enough, it's usually not too far away from a population of the California pipevine, because that's where it's going to lay its eggs. I said, we had a very large rainstorm, the largest of the season yesterday. And even though it's sunny and bright today and a lot of stuff is drying out, there's still these certain areas that are muddy. This is one of the best advantages to being on a virtual tour, is you don't have to slog through these various little areas of mud. You can just enjoy the beautiful day and the beautiful flowers without actually having to experience some of the inconveniences and discomforts of being out in the field. But the mud doesn't last very long, and we already go into a beautiful area of grassland with oak woodland behind it. One of the things that when you're out hiking at this time of year, particularly if you're in a moist canyon, is you have to be careful for the California newts. This is the time of year when they're out and about trying to find places to breed or to live, and out hunting for little slugs and other invertebrates that they feed upon. And when you're walking in these shady understories, these kind of habitats that they like, you can often find quite a few of them. And so you have to be, sometimes there's so many that you really have to be cautious not to step on a newt as you go around. It's very bad luck to step on a newt. And this time of year is one of the special things about this time of year is the plethora of California newts that you can see when you go into the moist canyons in the East Bay. Now we've gone up the ridge quite a ways, and we're walking along the edge of a woodland, and we're right in the area that might be called a a general coast live oak woodland mixed with some of the valley oak. But if we look across the way, we can see on that south-facing slope, very few trees. And part of that might be the history of the site. Maybe it was logged much more than the area over here. But a lot of that has to do with the fact that south-facing slopes are a lot hotter and drier than north-facing slopes. And so what we call aspect has a big impact on what you find growing there. And in fact, it's not just subtle. There you have almost all grassland. Here on this north-facing slope, turn around this way, on this north-facing slope, you'll see almost all trees dominating the landscape. Now right here, I'm going to step off the path a little bit to look at two interesting plants. One of them is a plant that can look different in different places, unfortunately, because this plant is poison oak here that we're looking at, this shrub with the very, very long, unbranched branches, the three-parted leaves. Remember the old saying, leaflets 3, let it be. And here we see something we don't see all the time, which is the spring flowers of poison oak. Now, sometimes you can detect a distinct sweet fragrance coming off of these flowers, but I don't really recommend sticking your nose into them for various reasons. You can also see growing over this poison oak very happily is a plant that's sometimes called the California wild cucumber or the manroot. This is Mara fabaceus, and it really is a member of the cucumber family. And it'll have these little white flowers, look quite a bit like the poison oak flowers really, but the female ones at least will form these really nice spiny fruits about the size of a ping pong ball. Let's go over here and see the young fruits on a very, very early flowering shrub. This is the California gooseberry. And if you've ever had gooseberries to eat or had gooseberry jam, it's made out of a domesticated one that doesn't have these spines. But one of the things that separates out gooseberries from currants, because they're close relatives, is the fact that the majority, not all, but the majority of gooseberries have these spines on their fruits. So they're not very good to eat for most things, although they're delicious inside. And you would say, why would a plant that's going to all the trouble to make these delicious berries put all these spines on the outside to prevent things from munching on them? And I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that it tends to be birds that do eat the inside of the fruit. They peck a hole in it, and instead of eating the whole fruit down, they have to just take the pith out of it, the kind of gelatinous, delicious part of it, and at the same time they'll eat the seeds and pass those through, and presumably maybe that's a better way for this plant to reproduce than if it had large herbivores like humans, or omnivores like humans, taking the fruits and like eating them wholesale. So here, as we walk up to the top of this hillock, we can see a bunch of trees, beautiful, beautifully sculptural trees. Most of the ones at the top of the slope are deciduous. As you go down the slope, you can see deciduous, but you can also see some of the evergreen coast live oak. All of these are oaks that I can see from here. And if we look at the very large oak tree in the middle, that is valley oak, Quercus lobata. And now if you go to the very top of the hill, you can see another deciduous oak. And you notice how the leaves on that one, they're just emerging, they look grayer. They don't look as fresh green, they look a little dusty even. And that would be our other common deciduous oak in this area. This is blue oak, Quercus douglasii. And blue oak is an oak, it often grows as here, close to valley oak, but it often grows in the very driest sites. The more high, it tends to be higher up the hill, higher up the ridge, where it grows in these very dry sites. And in fact, this is a tree that becomes very common in the very low foothills of the Sierra Nevada, where it forms a very typical, what they call a blue oak savanna, sometimes in association with gray pine, Pinus sabiniana. Here we don't have Pinus sabiniana, but we do have blue oaks growing on the drier sites, particularly in the upper parts of north-facing slopes. So here we have our third species of common deciduous oak tree in this part of California, although it's not as common here as it is in the foothills of the Sierra. But this is California black oak, Quercus collagii. named after one of the co-founders of the California Academy of Sciences. And you can see how different this oak is than the other ones we're looking at. First of all, the leaves are a lot bigger. Second of all, although we didn't have mature leaves in the other ones, you can see how pointy-tipped the lobes are on this one. And this is one of the distinguishing characteristics of the two main groups of oaks, the white oaks and the red or black oaks. And the valley oak and the blue oak belong to the white oak group, and the California black oak, of course, belongs to the black oak group. And this plant, there are many different plants that look like this, species of oak quercus in the eastern United States, some of them very hard to tell apart, but different species. Here in the West Coast, we only have one of these very typical looking, quote unquote, red or black oaks, and that is the California black oak. If you live in this area, one of the special plants around here that you can only find at Fernandez Ranch nearby is this one. This is a baby blue eyes, Nemophila menziesii, and it's an absolutely gorgeous plant. Most of the flowers that people describe as blue, or particularly nursery catalogs describe as blue, are some shade of purple. They're not really a true blue. But in baby blue eyes, we really do have that very, very rare shade of true blue, in this case kind of a sky blue. And this particular annual plant is one of the most beautiful wildflowers in California. It's not particularly rare in the state, but around here it is. In the Carquinez area, in Contra Costa County, it really is a very rare plant. And the only plant I've seen it locally, as I said before, is right here at Fernandez Ranch. And you have to come out right here in April, because it's a very early flowering wildflower. So you have to come out in April in order to see this gorgeous plant. And if you're lucky, you might even find a hillside that's, in some years, is almost covered by this particular beautiful, beautiful plant. As we come up the ridge, we start getting the thinner soil. We start picking up a very, very widespread wildflower. This is red maids. Not really red, it's more of a magenta. Red maids is found almost throughout California in open grassy areas. One suspects it was much, much, much more common before Europeans got here and introduced all the annual grasses, because it tends to grow in those same kind of places. And you don't see very good displays of it anymore. This is pretty nice right here, but still nothing spectacular. Mostly you only see the spectacular displays in very dry areas, in some places in Central Valley, or on serpentine-derived soil, where the soils are full of heavy metals and other things that make them poisonous to plants. And there, the native plants, native annual wildflowers tend to have an advantage over the annual grasses from Europe, and they tend to be able to give us probably an idea of what all the grasslands in California were like before the introduction of so many different invasive species of annual grasses and forbs. One of the most beautiful wildflowers, spring wildflowers, certainly of woodland wildflowers in California, is the purple Trillium, which is called Trillium chloropetulum, is the scientific name. And this is part of a northern genus that's found in woodlands. Like the eastern United States has quite a few species. China has quite a few species. We have a few here on the West Coast, but this is one of the biggest species of all. And if you go in certain areas, like in the Santa Cruz Mountains, this plant is not common, but still not very rare. In the East Bay, this plant has become rather rare, partly maybe because of people digging it up or people developing the land, but a lot of it had to do probably with the rebounding of the deer population. As deer conservation began back in the 1920s. Because Ruth Bancroft, of the Ruth Bancroft Garden fame, who lived to 107, she had told me years ago that when she was a girl in the Berkeley Hills back, right, in like the teens or early 20s, Trillium was in fact very common in the East Bay, but now you really have to go out of your way to find it. And we're very lucky that the Muir Land Trust has preserved the Fernandez Ranch, because here's this really very, very nice population, small, but very, very nice population of the purple-flowered Trillium. Here we are walking through some of the nice muddy areas that are left over from yesterday's big rainstorm that we had. And this is one of the nicest things, really, about being on a virtual tour, is that you can take advantage of the beautiful day and all the nice wildflowers, but you don't have to slog through the mud or later in the year fight the mosquitoes and the ticks or worry about a angry cow coming after you as you walk through the area. You can just take all the enjoyment and none of the discomforts. Okay, so you wanted me to do what?
Just kind of give me a look.
Okay. You want me to be turned like this or turned all the way around?
Yeah, turn all the way around.
Okay.
And then just turn around and leave.